So we're picking up in Acts chapter 23 where we left off. I'll go back and read the last section that I read to give our continuity there, as I'm in the habit of doing that. Gets us back into that chapter of what's going on. And we just know that we're at this place where Paul had been held in the barracks, where the commander of the Roman guard was there, having him in protective custody at this point, protecting him against the mobs of the Jews that were out there. And he could see that the Jews were not going to give him a fair hearing. It was not going to be anything fair about it. And so he made sure that he said, all right, you, Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, you come to my place to interview him and do the trial so that I can oversee it. See, and he took control over it that way, and it was good. So anyway, start verses 14 and 15 were the last part that I handled then. Let's read that. They went to the chief priests. Oh, no, sorry. Wait a minute. Forgot where I was. Okay, it didn't work out well for them, all right? That didn't work out well, and so they're holding him over. But verses 12, I probably should start at verse 12 and come up through 15 because that's better context. This is where the people, the weirdos got involved, the dagger men, right? Remember? All right. So the next morning, some Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. They went to the chief priests and the elders and said, "We have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about his case. We're ready to kill him before he gets here." All right, so for one thing, we already know this captain of the guard is not going to bring Paul over to the temple because he can't go in because he's Gentile, right? And his guys, his guards, they can't go in because they're Gentiles. So whatever goes on in there, they wouldn't be able to do anything unless they desecrated the temple, right? So that's not going to happen. They're not going to go up there. They are going to have to come down to him if they want to interview him again. So that won't happen anyway. But where we're going to get into this time, this second half of the chapter, is how this conspiracy of these daggermen, remember I explained that last time, they had the nickname the daggermen, and they would have the daggers in their cloaks and go up in a crowd and stab some Roman official, and they were assassins. And so most likely this group of the 40 was comprised of a lot of the daggermen. It may not have been all, but they all took this oath, and very silly to take an oath on something like that, right? I mean, Jesus said, "Yet let your yes be yes and your no be no. Anything else is from the evil one." So we need to not be taking oaths like that because that puts you in this position of really looking like an idiot when you can't do anything about it. What are you going to do? Break your oath now and eat or die? You know, and I don't think starving yourself works. So anyway, Romans 10:2 says, talked about people that had a real zeal and commitment to the law, but their zeal was not in according to knowledge. And that's kind of where these people fit into that. It was a zeal that is based on ignorance. So I want to note also something here that I don't think I put in there last time, but I want to make sure it's worth noting here, that though the plan of the assassination came from the group of zealots, not the Sanhedrin itself, this plan of assassinating him and everything came from this group of zealots, but the Jewish leadership did go along with it. The Sanhedrin went along with this. So what does that tell you about the spiritual state of the Sanhedrin at this time? And I know I spent a little bit of time talking about that last time, about how God's train had made a turn on the tracks, right? The Jews kept going straight. They just decided not to follow God's plan. They didn't accept Messiah that was sent to them. And they kept going on into their traditions and the fiddler climbed on the roof, right? And that's when it all started, you know. And since then, it's all been about traditions. God is not in the temple of the Jews any longer. Well, for one thing, they don't have a temple anymore. In 70 AD, that was all reduced to rubble and torn down and everything, and they haven't had one since. Prophecy tells us they will have one, that it will be rebuilt because they will be giving the daily sacrifice again when the lawless one, the man of lawlessness, the Bible doesn't actually name him the Antichrist, but that's what we've called him because he is the Antichrist, not just an Antichrist. There are a lot of Antichrists, right? There are a lot of them, but there's this one particular that'll be tied to the beast and the false prophet and all that kind of stuff in prophecies. That's a different guy. When that happens, he's going to go into the temple and desecrate it. So there has to be one. Right? So we know they're going to rebuild the temple. And we also know things, you know, current events and everything, that they're ready to build it. They just can't quit arguing about where it's going to be built. So whenever they figure that out, get that all hashed out, they're going to build the temple again, and it will be there. But God is not going to set up his presence in that temple. See, we need to understand this. I'm not saying the Jews are evil individually. I'm not saying that they're evil or that there's anything ungodly about the individual person, although not accepting Messiah is ungodly. Saying no to him is like spitting God in the face. Or being out there drowning and he's throwing you a life ring and said, no, I'll be fine. You know, that's really what it is, you know. But it is rejecting him to his face. So there is an evil in that. And God is not working through Judaism anymore. He said there's a new covenant in my blood. Jesus said that. There's a new covenant in my blood. And the Passover was set aside for the Lord's Supper. It was done on a Passover, celebrating Passover, but showing that it was now fulfilled. And from here on, we would be doing it different, and they weren't going to break the bones of the animal and all that stuff, and there would be no more animal sacrifice. Now, if you want to have lamb for dinner, that's fine, you know, but there won't be a sacrifice accepted. They'll start doing it again when they build the new temple. The third temple will be there and be ready to go. You know, the whole sacrificial system doing it, but God's not accepting those. It's like his currency changed now. He's not into that. We need to understand that. He's not in it. These people who were now the ruling council of the Jews in the temple, the Sanhedrin, they did not have the Spirit of God with them nor in them, let alone in them. I mean, the Spirit of God is not in these guys. They're going along with an assassination attempt for someone that is preaching the good news to Gentiles. That's all. He hasn't done anything worthy of being incarcerated, let alone killed. You know, they don't like what he says. It's a difference of opinion, but it's not it's not a criminal action. It's only they think it's criminal action, you see. So God was not in this. They were so corrupted by their positions of power and their politics that there was no thought of God's will in anything they did. Not only had God left the temple, but they also had kicked him out of their hearts. They would not hear him and hear from him. So here's where we pick up now today in verse 16 and 17. But when the son of Paul's sister heard of this plot, he went into the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him." Our example from Paul at this point is the balance between, and this is something I think, if we're going to have application in this section of this chapter to our lives, this is one of the things you can apply to your life. He is balancing between faith in God and the wisdom that God put in his head, right? We do have to do that, right? That's there again. Let's talk about the drowning man. The flood's rising, right? And he crawls up on his roof. And some guys come by on a life raft, say, "Come on, jump in." "No, that's all right. God's going to save me." Okay, pretty soon, another boat comes by. Come on, this is, and he's just barely, the whole house is underwater now, and he's just standing on it still, and it's coming up here. Come on, jump in the boat. We'll save you. No, God's going to save me. It'll be fine. Then a helicopter comes over, and he's treading water out there, and he's drowning. No, it's all right. Go on. God will save me. As the rope comes down so he could grab a hold. Nope. And the guy drowns, and he dies. And he wakes up in heaven. He said, God, I thought you were going to save me. He goes, well, I sent you 2 boats and a helicopter. What do you want? Right? Okay, so, this is the kind of thing we have to remember. God gave us a brain, use it. He's told us in His Word the kinds of things, how He wants us to be, if we'll read it in context according to the way He gave it to us. The legalism, if you just read the New Testament, you'll find out legalism is not what He's requiring. He wants a heart that is trusting in Him, that believes by faith that He's got you. And that doesn't mean stupidly out there in the water and not taking the life raft or anything like that, but it means I trust that He's got me, and when this comes along, that must be how He's delivering me. Well, duh, right? We have to but Paul is doing that. He's using his brain. He's using the talents that God gave him, the thinking cap, that he's got there. And he has full faith and trust in God. And he's demonstrating that here. So I think that that's a very important thing for us to learn. He sent his nephew in, and by the way, we didn't even know prior to this that he even had a sister, let alone nephew. It's never been mentioned, and they're not named. But he'd been told by the Lord that he would testify about him in Rome, and he was encouraged by that and believed. But just how would he get to Rome safely? That was not in the details that God had given. So he wisely used the barracks and the commander and the army of Rome to his advantage, knowing that God was in control of even those who didn't know Him. Right? Do you know that? Do you realize that? God is in control of people that don't even believe in Him. Just because they don't believe in Him doesn't mean that He's still not working for you. He's for you. You got to say that. I know you're for me, Lord. I trust you. I know that you've got this. And you'll use these heathens. I used to call my cousin a heathen, and she hated that, But I was just joking with her, really, She might have actually been, but, She claims to have faith, so we'll leave it at that. But anyway, she might be watching this, so I guess I should watch my mouth, huh? She'll remember, because heathen was my nickname for her, so she'll remember that. But she was an older cousin, I was a little brat back then when I did that, so. Anyway, all right, so what I'm trying to say here is we should remember this as well. Careful planning and using everything at our disposal is not a lack of faith, but acting on our faith. Now, another thing, I'll get to that next time. Let's go on to these next verses, 18 to 22 now. So he took him to the commander. The centurion said, Paul the prisoner sent for me and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you. The commander took the young man by the hand, drew him aside, and asked, what is it you want to tell me? He said, some Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. Don't give in to them, because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for him. They have taken an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are ready now, waiting for your consent to their request. The commander dismissed the young man with this warning: don't tell anyone that you have reported this to me. This guy's smart too, right? He's using the brain God gave him, because he's wondering about this God already. I can see it. He's starting to be curious about this God. What is going on here? But anyway, we're not given the name of Paul's nephew, as I said earlier, or even much information about his family. And we know that Now we know that he had a sister, but many scholars believe that Paul had been that Paul's family had disowned him over the Christian conversion. A lot of people think that, when that happened, his whole family disowned him, and because they're Jewish and they didn't want to have anything to do with him anymore. Maybe. That's speculation, though, because the word doesn't say. So you can speculate. If you ever hear someone teaching, well, that's Paul's family disowned him after, we don't know that for sure. You have to say it as that speculation, because I hate it when you just put words in God's mouth. He didn't tell us for sure. And someday we're going to find out the whole story, right? And then we're going to go, oh, I had that wrong. Well, if you had just been careful in how you read it, you'd realize he didn't tell us that happened. But we wondered if maybe that's what happened. But here's something else. It's also commonly believed that he had at least at one time, been married. He seems to have a fairly decent understanding of marriage relationships. And sometimes when he talks about that, it's almost as, of course, God, the Holy Spirit could be giving him that, but it's almost like he's talking from someone who has been there at one time. Here's the other reason for the speculation that Paul may have been married at one time, was that it was commonly at that time, according to other writings and things, it was common at that time for a young Jewish man, in order to be in training to be a rabbi and all that, and actually be in place in the fellowship and be a member of the Sanhedrin, they wouldn't trust him if it wasn't someone married. He had to have his own wife, or he wasn't trusted to be in that situation, according to their custom at that time. So that's why people speculate that Paul was probably married young at that time. But at whatever case, he's not any longer. Maybe his wife wanted out of it. He does talk about let the unbeliever go. And you don't hold them to that. Okay, and later on when he talks about, between a married couple, one gets saved, the other does not believe. If they're willing to stay with you, do it, because you might bring them to the Lord, right? But if they don't want to, you let them go. They're not under obligation any longer, and you do not sin by letting them go. And they go do their own thing, then you're released, right? But you must, when you remarry again, find a Christian believer. Don't do that again, right? That Paul talked like that. So it makes you almost wonder if maybe that was his own experience. But there again, it's all speculation. We don't know this for certain. It's just based on, sometimes you speculate on knowledge of situations. Sometimes it's just a gut hunch. But speculation always needs to be recognized as speculation. The Bible does not say one way or another. So why did I spend so much time on it then? Just because it's a topic that comes up. All right. So the wisdom God gave this commander was used as well in concealing the knowledge of the plot to kill Paul and move out before the petition from the council was even tendered. So, this guy God's using this guy. Right? Whether he even realizes it or not, God's using him. He's provided him as a lifeboat to Paul. Right? All right, let's go on to verses 23 and 24 now. Then he called 2 of his centurions and ordered them, get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide horses for Paul so that he may be taken safely to Governor Felix. Set your watches. 9 tonight, right? They didn't have watches yet. It's always kind of freaks me out when I read stuff like this. How do they know it was 9? But anyway, they probably had, in towns, they probably had someone that would get up and say, 9 o'clock and all is well across the city. You think, whatever. But how did he know? Once the sun goes down, it's sundown. How do you know what time it is? Well, maybe you got these 1 hour hourglasses saying, but how do you know what an hour is yet if you don't have tick, 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 gears and all that? Anyway, I don't know. 9 tonight, about the 9th hour is what they would probably say. So, but anyway, this is an example here of first century Roman protective custody. What was protective custody like for a Roman citizen in those days? This was it. 470 soldiers surrounding and escorting Paul safely out of Jerusalem and on his way to go see Governor Felix. 470 of them, right? Now, notice that the first, what he said was 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen. 400 of these guys are on foot. Only 70 of them are on horseback. So, but they're all there. And the spearmen could surround real fast, and nobody's going to get through that wall. And then the foot soldiers, too, are right behind them. And the cavalry is all running around, doing their thing. So this is, and Paul gets to ride on a horse. He doesn't have to walk along like the rest of them. They got a horse for him too. So anyway, this is showing the sovereignty of God. We can see that in here, right? Shows the sovereignty of God in the actions of these secular authorities who don't even believe in him yet. And the resultant spread of the gospel westward among the Gentiles proves this. God was sovereign in this and orchestrating this whole thing. So what can and will he do for you? Right? I don't know that you need a 470 soldier escort team to get you from one place to the other, but what will he do for you to make sure that when you're about his business that you're going to get there safely? Is your faith strong enough to where you can say, if God has me doing something, if this is his will that I go do this, I'm going to get there. Nothing's going to happen to me on the way there. If God's will is for me to go and jump out of a perfectly good aircraft with a parachute on, it's something I have never done. But if his will was for me to do that, I would land safely. Unless his will was that was how he was taking me home. We always got to remember that could be it too. But my faith is such that, I truly believe that I'm not going out of this world as a minute before God's plan for me is. And I'm not going to be here a minute longer than God's plan for me here is. Right? Whenever it is, that's when it's going to be. And he knows when that is. And do I trust him that that's the perfect timing? Have to, right? I have to trust that the all-knowing, all-powerful God knows what he's doing. Otherwise, I'm without hope, right? I don't know who's flying this ship. I don't think he knows what he's doing. Is that the kind of faith we have? No, we need to be assured in our faith that we know he knows what he's doing and he's got this, right? Paul did. All right. Verses 25 to 30 now. He, the commander, he wrote a letter as follows. Claudius Lysias, to his excellency, Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him. But I came with my troops and rescued him, for I had learned that he is a Roman citizen. I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin. I found that the accusations had to do with the questions about their law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. When I was informed of a plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. I also ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him. So, remind yourself again, who wrote this book of the Bible? Luke. St. Luke, right? Paul's traveling companion. Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. How did Luke know what was in this letter? Right? How did he have a copy of this letter to put it down in here? Right? Well, some of this is pretty easy explained. Back in the beginning, when he first starts writing, and in the beginning of his gospel, Luke says that many interviews had taken place by himself and by others that brought him information, and interviews from other people and testimonies and documents that had been discovered. And he had compiled all this stuff to put together this story of the Gospel of Luke and Luke Part 2, the Acts of the Apostles. This was trial preparation documents for Paul before Caesar. That's why we have this stuff. And remember that. This is the reason this was written, although the Holy Spirit was in it and wanted us to have copies of it so that we would know too. But the same reason we got copies of it was the same reason that Luke got copies of it to give to the officials in Rome for Paul's defense. So that's probably what happened. This was probably such an official letter that it was made public. It was read before Felix publicly. We'll see that in a minute. And that was probably out loud in front of witnesses. And then it would have been something that would have been, and Paul would have probably had a customary copy of it because it was part of his case. They were a lot more sophisticated at that time than a lot of times we think. We think that because they didn't have microwaves and watches and cars yet, and Harleys, that they must have been, cavemen, right? But they weren't. They actually were very sophisticated in a lot of their things. And so preparing documents and copies to give to somebody, there were people's job was that I'm a human Xerox machine, right? They had jobs of being copyists. I'm going to take this and we're going to make 5 copies of it. And we're going to write it down note for note, make it look exactly like that. It was more about drawing than it was even interpreting. We're going to make it look exactly like that because sometimes there was a symbol drawn, and get into that one if we study Revelation. There's some things in there that people tried to interpret as language when it may have just been a picture. And that really makes things a lot more understandable if you realize stuff like that. Anyway, all right, so at this point we learned the commander's name. First time we've heard his name, Claudius Lysias. Claude for the rest of us. So Claude was the guy that sent him up there. This letter was an important piece of defense for the Christians struggling against the persecution of the Jews later, because this was the finding of a commander of a local area. He had the same power that a local, like a county or whatever, judge would have. He could hear cases and make decisions based on his knowledge of the law and all of that. The commander of all the guard there had certain judicial authority. So his findings and writing it down and forwarding on to a higher court was precedent. That just like we have now, if a lower court has findings, those are set as precedent. They'll take those later on, and other cases will say, this guy found that this was not against the law. And in the case of Saul of Tarsus versus the Jews, there's case precedent here that the thing that he was doing was not worthy of a crime of to be imprisoned. To be incarcerated whatsoever or punished. It was not worthy of that. That was his judgment, you see. So that would have been something they probably would have made a lot of copies of and passed around to lots of people. You getting how this probably got out? Because when other people are being persecuted by the Jews, they say, we have precedent here that us saying that we believe in this and that our Messiah came and you guys killed him and, but he rose from the dead and then ascended back into heaven. That's our story. We're sticking to it. And that's not against the law, right? See, so something like this happening, Paul, his experience is helping the case for many other persecuted Christians at that time. So this is a very important thing for us to understand. It's clever how Claudius left out the fact that he had put Paul in chains and ordered that he be flogged prior to a subordinate saying, oh, by the way, I just found out he's a Roman citizen. What? Oh, get him out of those chains, right? Let the guy loose, but keep him here because we need to protect him. And then he went to him and talked. Anyway, remember the story. But he's making himself out in this letter. You can read it again when you want to, but he's making himself out to kind of look like a hero here, and leaving out the part that might have got him a slap on the wrist, So, all right, verses 31 and 32 now. So the soldiers, carrying out their orders, took Paul with them during the night and brought him as far as Antipatris. The next day, they let the cavalry go on with him while they returned to the barracks. Okay, so the 400 dudes on foot got to go back home and didn't have to go the rest of the way. By the way, that was quite a trek for them on feet, because it was over 35 miles. So that journey there was over 35 miles that they marched. But the cavalry of 70 horsemen would still be plenty of protection, since they're that far from Jerusalem. They're out of the city and they're out on a traveled byway, so 70 cavalrymen around him is going to be fine from here on out. It's still quite an entourage, right? And quite a protective custody, I think. All right, so verses 33 to 35 now. When the cavalry arrived in Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and handed Paul over to him. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from. Learning that he was from Cilicia, he said, "I will hear your case when your accusers get here." Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace. Okay, so according to the law of Rome, and I've learned this from my study, we wouldn't, if it's just someone that says, "Oh, I've read the Bible cover to cover 3 or 4 times," well, not under instruction, maybe, it's not with knowledge, because there are a lot of these things you have to discover later on, right? And that's why you go and you go through the studies with someone who's done the homework and that can help explain it, but because these people that talk like that, they say, "Oh, I've read the Bible cover to cover 3 or 4 times. I don't need to go to church." They didn't go to church when they weren't under the instruction of anybody. They just picked up Gideon's Bible out of the motel room drawer or something when they were bored. And it was before, when they only had one channel, and after a certain time at night, it was just the test pattern, right? Remember those days? Yeah, kids, that was, anyway. But according to the law of Rome at the time, a procurator, or province governor, right, could hear a case that either the alleged crime took place in, or this is where the alleged criminal is from. Okay, so if the criminal is from your town and that's your jurisdiction, you can hear the case. If the crime happened in your town, you could hear the case. All right, so nowadays it's kind of like, no, you don't hear the case unless you're the presiding judge over where the crime took place. That's what ours is about, But there, if the guy is from there, you could hear his case. So that could lead, I don't know, that could lead to some preferential treatment, Well, this happened down there in another area. Those guys have it in for our people. So I'm going to cut him some slack here. They might go soft on crimes that happen outside of their area, but it was allowed by Rome, and especially a governor, the procurator. So since Cilicia, where Paul was from, Tarsus, the town in Cilicia, Cilicia was not a full province fully, but it was then part of and under the rule of the larger, what they called the legate of Syria, in the Syrian area. They're the legate of Syria. I know this is stuff you don't really care, but I'm going to tell you anyway. Felix was a deputy of the legate. So he could hear this case because Paul, and he probably figured to forward him on up to the legate, it would be like a Supreme Court, the justices, right? Was too small of a case for them. This wasn't anything big enough to bother them with. So since he is a deputy of them, he would go ahead and hear it. So that's just giving you a reason why Felix felt he could do this at this point anyway. So he would hear it, but the accusers had, according to the Roman law, the accusers had to be present, making the accusation in front of the judge, the governor, and in front of the one being accused. He can face his accusers, right, and be there. We have that in our criminal justice system too, and it goes clear back to then, to the Roman times. And in fact, I think even the Greeks had a little bit of something like that too in their judicial system. You know, the accused has a right to face his accusers in a trial. So this goes back a long time. Anyway, he would hear it. The accusers had to be present and make their accusation to him in front of him and Paul. So he would hear it when they got there. Meanwhile, Paul gets to stay, kind of a house arrest, but protective custody in Herod's palace. Oh, shucks. I have to stay in a palace, you know. I mean, it's like, well, Felix is like, you know, Felix is there. And by the way, he married, he was married to Herod's sister and stuff like that. So there was some family politics going on in here too. But that's where he was staying, and that's where Paul was going to get to stay there as well. Keep him guarded. Like under guard, we kind of see that as like he's a prisoner, but he really wasn't so much a prisoner as someone who was being protected until the trial. They're not going to let him get away for his own protection's sake, but he's being guarded. So that's the way they left it. He gets to live in Herod's palace until it happens. So next chapter, chapter 24, we'll figure out how this continues on. And we're going to be seeing in the next 3 chapters how this continues on and how Paul's under arrest and his appeals to this guy and appeal to that guy and all that stuff, you know, and we're going to continue to learn a lot about this. And as we do, I mean, I think we see this as a historical, factual account of things that happened, but we also see how God worked and how he had this and how he had a plan and protected him along the way. The shipwrecks and all that kind of stuff. You know, we just know that God was keeping him. So we learn that about ourselves and our relationship to God. He might be saying, oh, well, that's when I'm going to take you home. But if that's not when he's going to take you home, that's not when you're going to go. Especially if you're serving him under his will, doing what he's wanting you to be doing here. Then he's going to want you to be doing that until he's ready for you to come home. So just remember that and have faith in him and in that fact. Let's go to prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for these things that we learn about you and about our relationship to you. Thank you for the interestingness that you've given us in this book of the Acts of the Apostles and how we're reading these stories and it piques our interest. And Lord, we ask that you would continue that. Keep us interested in the rest of your word. So we want to learn more and more and more about you, about how you've acted in the past, so we can know about how we can trust that you will act in the future. And we look forward to learning more, Lord. Thank you for your blessings. We look forward to more of them as we go out from here today. Your blessing, your guidance, and your protection. And all these things we pray through Jesus Christ our Lord. And the Lord be with you all.